I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. So first things first, this is a poetry episode. This is an episode in which I'm going to be talking about poetry. I've been trying to figure out quite how to do this for a while, and then in the middle of my figuring out how to do it, there was a presidential election. People had a lot of strong feelings about, have a lot of strong feelings about. I have a lot of strong feelings about. I'm not going to talk about that really, but I am aware that it is on a lot of people's minds. For good reason, it is on my mind. But that's not what I have to offer here. I don't think... it's not that I don't have opinions. It's just that I don't think my opinions about politics are very interesting. So, no surprises to anybody who has listened to this for more than 10 minutes where my head is. I talked to Jonathan the other night. I had a fake beer with him. He's a real man, so he had a Jameson. And it felt like it might be a decent thing just to acknowledge that was in the air. So that's about all I have to say about that. Because what I actually want to talk about today is something that everybody can agree on: Palestine. I got a really good email a little over a week ago from a listener named Leila. I mentioned this on the show last week in response to the episode in which Cameron and Brian and I talked about an issue of Poetry Magazine, and I'll just read from Leila's note so you can get a little bit of her context. She says, "I'm writing to let you know, in case no one already has, that Faisal Moyuddin, whom you refer to in your latest episode as the Palestinian guy, is not Palestinian. He is of Pakistani heritage, according to his website. I suspect that might have something to do with both why Ceasefire Haiku was published and why it seems so tacky and tonally amiss, though I personally do not find such lines as 'The winter wind grieves for Gaza too' so terribly egregious. It is the contrite poem of an American witnessing U.S.-backed genocide. I do find striking, though I'm not sure what it reveals, that specifically because you believed the poem to be written by a victim or target of the atrocity that inspired it, you chose to speak only and exclusively derisively about it. Had you been willing instead to critique it, you might have come to realize what you were in fact reading with all its attendant flaws." And then she includes a really thorough, I don't know how thorough it is, but she includes a substantial list of what she calls actual Palestinian poetry of this moment. And I'm going to get to that. First, just a slightly more detailed response to Leila's initial correction. First, again, thank you. I appreciate it. As always, please do write in to let me know when I get something wrong so I can correct it. Did get it, sometimes some corrections being more significant than others. I got a good one from Julie Steiner about I had mixed up Noah and Lot, so that was my error. Maybe more on that. I may have a trolley problem question for Brian about that another time. But I do always appreciate a good factual correction. Second, the lines "The winter wind grieves for Gaza too." That claim was one Cameron specifically objected to, saying, "No, it doesn't," as in the winter wind does not grieve for Gaza too. It is a classic example of the pathetic fallacy, which I think is not always bad, but is usually bad. I know Elijah is very militant about the pathetic fallacy being bad. I'm not really sold by those lines, though those were not the lines that most annoyed me. To be honest, the whole poem annoyed me. I will read through it and to address Leila's next note, that I was definitely remiss in calling him Palestinian. The truth is I simply saw an Arabic name and the context of the Palestinian conflict, and so I made an assumption. Slight clarification, though, because she said, because you... I do find it striking, though I'm not sure what it reveals, that specifically because you believed the poem to be written by a victim or target of the atrocity that inspired it, you chose to speak only and exclusively derisively about it. So I did not criticize this poem specifically because I believed it to be written by a victim. I criticized it because it's a very bad poem, I think. And I didn't analyze it because I didn't want to, the premise of the episode was we were choosing our top and bottom poems, each for each of us for the issue. And I didn't want this to be my bottom. I didn't want this to be the worst poem, my personal least favorite poem for the issue, because it is about terrible suffering. And I didn't want to, I didn't want that to be my focus for the episode. There were a lot of bad poems by people, of the relevant groups or of relevant authority or otherwise. I did say that I thought there seemed to be a trend among the poems published of a claim to authoritative suffering, right? Whether this was at the level of losing a loved one or losing a lot more than that. That seemed to me to be one of the criteria that was apparently in the minds of poetry's editors. That's just speculation on my part based on the table of contents. I'll read through Ceasefire Haiku, though that is not the focus of this episode. This is Ceasefire Haiku by Faisal Mohyuddin. All night the somber song of chimes. The winter wind grieves for Gaza too. Rage, the broken heart of a broken world, breaking free to free the truth. Shame, a legacy your descendants will decry, bemoan, be cursed by. To remain silent is consent, is wrong, is more deadly than more bombs. You can't really see me, except as your conscience cleanser, your blindfold. When I condemn crimes, you call me culprit. Settle my heart to scrub yours. The river, the sea, between them endless cruelty. The ache to be free. Fear, even trauma sold, is a prison. You've sold out, not gotten out. Killed. Those who counted the killed. The uncounted, unaccounted for. More, 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 more. I realized rereading this that the poem gave me, maybe the poem is commenting on my bad assumption about an Arabic name, but I genuinely read the stanza, you can't really see me except as your conscience cleanser, your blindfold. When I condemn crimes, you call me culprit, settle my heart to scrub yours. I read that as him identifying with the subject, with people in Palestine or people of Palestinian descent. So that was maybe that was my misreading his intention, but that certainly did not help to clarify that he is not of Palestinian descent. To my cursory reading, because I did not give this a very close reading. What is very bad about this? I think it is cheap, manipulative, trite. I do think that the pathetic fallacy here is unconvincing. They're human beings who grieve. There's, cause for grief. The winter wind grieves for Gaza too seems not convincingly put either. I think the lining up of abstractions followed by a colon and then a very vague and cliche-riddled characterization. Rage, the broken heart of a broken world, breaking free to free the truth. Shame, a legacy your descendants will decry, bemoan, be cursed by. The second one is at least less carelessly obvious than the first, but neither is persuasive. To remain silent is consent, is wrong, is more deadly than more bombs. I think, if you want to make a political argument about the importance of speaking up or silence, that's one thing. to remain silent is more deadly than more bombs seems to me like an almost grotesquely, obviously false claim. Like a really sort of appalling, nauseating claim. To remain silent is more deadly than more bombs. He's writing about a place where bombs are dropping every day, and he says your silence is deadlier than the bombs falling on the houses of people living in this real place at this real time right now where this is actually happening. To me, that just seems like clownishly, pathetically misplaced. Like shut the fuck up, Faisal Mohyuddin. What the fuck are you talking about? You can't really see me except as your conscience cleanser, your blindfold. I mean, if what he means is that in reading this poem about Palestine, written by a guy with an Arabic name, I mistakenly assumed he was of Palestinian descent. In that sense, if he's saying you can't really see me, he's right. That was my error, and that was my carelessness, and I own that. I apologize for that. But I really don't know what he thinks he's saying otherwise. You can't see me except as your conscience cleanser, your blindfold. So I, the poet writing this, help you feel better. I mean, I think there may be some truth to that will come up later. Honestly, if he had written just that by itself, that kind of starkness, this would be a much more interesting poem. When I condemn crimes, you call me culprit, settle my heart to scrub yours. Sure. I mean, it's very inelegant. When I condemn crimes, you call me culprit. So this is when people speaking on behalf of Gaza condemn the excesses and the killings of the IDF, then frequent retort is, well, there's murder and war crimes and terrorism coming out of Gaza, and there are settlements happening. I mean, the settlements, that does seem like a little bit of a conflation. There are Israelis doing the settling, and there are Israelis bombing Gaza. You know, this doesn't seem like a particularly insightful way to articulate the situation. The river, the sea, between them endless cruelty, the ache to be free. The river, the sea, we'll come back to that. It's referring to the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern and western boundaries of Israel, with the Gaza Strip and the West Bank included within those bounds. This is one where he uses a lighter font. Like he uses the ink lightens up and goes gray, I guess, in order to emphasize the word free, the ache to be, and then the ache to be free. It just feels like teenager shit. Fear, even trauma, sold. That's SOULED, is a prison. You've sold out, not gotten out. Fear, even trauma, sold. Fear with the soul of trauma is a prison. So even if you've suffered and that's why you feel fear, your fear is still a prison. I mean, again, like that seems like, I guess that's a statement, but it gets like the worst kind of therapy speak. And I wonder, like, why is this in a poem? What is this doing? This is a clumsy statement. It doesn't seem like any kind of poem. Killed those who counted the killed, the uncounted, unaccounted for, more, and the mores fade out as well, down to pale gray and to white. By my lights, it's an incredibly crass way to refer to real deaths. So that's my very, still somewhat truncated, but that's my reading of Ceasefire Haiku. I do, I want to give it its due, and I think that's honestly more than its due. I don't want to talk a whole lot more about that because there are some other better poems to talk about, better poems and poems with a different kind of authority than that one. And I hope, Leila, it's clear as I get a little heated about that poem. I'm not getting heated at you, but honestly, mostly at Poetry Magazine for publishing it more than anything. really, it's Poetry Magazine is. I mean, the people I was most so this list that she sent included a lot of poems. It also included 2 hour-long interviews, one with Fadi Judah and one with Musa Babu Toa, and in both of those, as with the Poetry Magazine publication, I found myself most annoyed with the hosts of the poets being interviewed. Patrick Otuma, I don't know, who's not a well-known poet, but a woman who was in charge of the organization, the Jackson organization Jackson Foundation, I think, that gave Judah the prize. She was unbelievably smug and condescending. Padraig Otuma, though my heart went out to him as a pink-faced, sweaty Irish guy under the spotlight, it was just soft. It was the worst kind of soft pedaling, sycophantic interview. And it reminded me of like Paul Muldoon at his worst doing the old New Yorker poetry podcast, just sucking up with no fiber, no spine, not even any like provocative question. I don't mean that he needed to be confrontational, just that he needed to talk like a fucking human being and not like a human-shaped embroidered pillow. And then Amy Goodman, who interviewed Musa Babu Toa, I'll talk about that interview a little more in a moment, but I know she does a lot of good. I know there are Democracy Now! People who listen to this podcast, and Democracy Now! Does a lot of good, and God bless you. Boy, I could not stand her in that interview. I've never seen somebody more satisfied with herself for hosting this genuinely sympathetic Palestinian poet. I found myself coming away from that interview really liking Musa Babu Toa and being completely unable to stand Amy Goodman, who just could not stop patting herself on the back for what a good job she was doing platforming this poor man. So in addition to the Judah interview and the Toa interview, Judah read some poems, Toa read some poems. During that interview, there was a clip included, and I'm actually just going to copy paste Leila's list of poems and interviews. I'm just going to copy paste it all because she included some very helpful notes along with them. So I'm going to copy paste all of that into the show notes so you can look at all of this, because I'm not going to read all of these poems for a couple of reasons. But I encourage you to go check out all of this stuff, and I encourage you to come to different conclusions than I did, as always. But it's very, very generous list that Leila put together, and I'm very glad to be able to share it with all of you. During the interview with Musa Babu Toa, Democracy Now! Included a short clip that was a little viral video. Apparently it had gotten a lot of attention, recorded by Brian Cox, great actor, most recently prominently featured in Succession. Amazing performance there, as in many other movies and stage plays. He was a big stage actor for a long time as well. Great part not great part, pretty good part in the great TV, probably best TV show ever made, Deadwood. Very different role in that one. But he read a poem by someone Toa said he knew personally and liked, had a little bit of a relationship with. Another poet named, well, maybe I'll get to that. I'll get to that later, because I felt incredibly torn by this. But I'll start with Judah, because I thought he was, of the poets that Leila included, which was, as I said, Fadi Judah, Musa Babu Toa, and then in addition to that, a number of less well-known, like when Jonathan came over, he literally was carrying a copy of Musa Babu Toa's book, Forest of Noise, which was published by Knopf very recently. So, he has a little bit of a profile. Fadi Judah obviously has a pretty big profile. The rest of the poets were new to me. They are obviously better known in other parts of the world. Some of them were very young, and two of them died during the current conflict. Some of the others live in Gaza now, and some of the others are from there, but now live in America or elsewhere. Their names were Heba Abu Nada, who was killed in Gaza in a bombing recently. Nur Khalil Abu Shamala, who lives in Gaza, had a couple of poems. Olivia Elias, who was born in Palestine, lives elsewhere now. Yahya Ashur, who lives outside of Gaza, and Nadine Mortaja, writing from Gaza, in Gaza. And then, the one who's not included in her list, but who is mentioned in the Toa interview, the one whose poem Brian Cox read, is Rafat al-Arir, and he did die in a bombing during this conflict. So this was an incredibly wrenching experience to encounter all of these. I mean, reading the work of poets, some very young who died very recently in a violent conflict. Heba Abu Nada died in her home. Her house was bombed. She's not a combatant. She's a poet, and she was a professor. I'm, as with politics more generally, I don't know if this is just politics. I tend to think I have less to say about the major political questions themselves than I do about how we talk about them. I will just briefly note something I've mentioned before, which is that in following, and I do follow both right-wing and left-wing media on the conflict and on other issues of the day, it has been striking to me how little anybody will agree on anybody else's basic givens about the conflict. That it is pretty uncommon among those speaking on behalf of Palestine even to acknowledge that obvious, horrifying murders were committed against civilians by Gazans on October 7th. It's very difficult to get any kind of acknowledgement of that, or that Hamas engages in deliberate violence against civilians. It is also extremely difficult to get any kind of acknowledgement from those speaking on behalf of Israel that whatever else you might want to say about the origins of the conflict, at this point, the scale is dizzying. Like the scale of violence, if the initiating crime of this particular conflict was October 7th, then the number of Palestinians killed since then is 40 times that. So, I'm with Brian. I don't think there is an easy, obvious solution. I don't think everybody who chants from the river to the sea at a college protest is a terrorist calling for the elimination of all Jews. I also don't think that, I don't think Israel's going anywhere. And I think the idea that you can just do away with Israel or have Israel have a state in which there's no, have just one big openly democratic state between the Mediterranean Sea, and the Jordan River. I think that idea is also naive, if not willfully so. I don't think there's easy solutions. I certainly don't have easy solutions, but I'm one of the reasons I'm not really going to try to offer a lot of commentary on the war itself is that I'm not the person you should turn to for that. I don't know enough. I'm not, as I said, I don't have interesting opinions on this stuff. I might have some interesting opinions about how we talk about it, specifically how we write poems about it. And reading these poems, I was deeply torn because, with the exception of some of Fadi Judah's poems, with the exception of one of Moshe Babu Toa's poems, and with the exception of a few moments and lines in some of the other poems, Olivia Elias seemed to be, a little bit one of the, more in control than many of the other writers. These seem to me very bad poems. Not bad people. I mean, good. I don't know if they're good people or not. People who clearly have suffered a great deal, and whose plight is incredibly moving. But these seem to be mostly very amateurish poems. They didn't seem gallingly tone deaf the way that Faisal Muhyiddin's poem was. They seemed extremely earnest and most moving in their reportage. In, particularly most of Abu Toa's poems, most moving in simply recounting what had happened. But as poems, as lyrics, they seemed to me, student-like. I mean, they seemed not serious. It didn't seem to be a demonstration of great artistry. Now, I think it's incredibly important to note that while Judah and Toa write in English, I believe the rest of these were translated from Arabic. That may not be true of Olivia Elias. I think she may be writing in English. No, she's not. She's not writing in English. That's also translated. But I believe almost all, if not all of these poems were translated from Arabic. And so it seems really difficult to pass any kind of meaningful judgment on them except as translations. And yet, with many of them, the problem to me didn't seem to be a problem of translation. I mean, it's always possible that these are otherwise simplistic, sentimental utterances that are rendered so beautifully in the original that the simplicity of their statement or the appeal to emotion at the level that they have it is not off-putting the way it is in the version I can read, but I can only judge the version I can read. And the result was not that I lost any sympathy for them, for the people writing this, or for the people they're writing about. The result was that I felt very conflicted about what it means to celebrate poems like these as poems. As I said, I think Fadi Judah is pretty skillful, though not honestly brilliantly so. He also seemed to be a smart guy, very well-spoken guy, very poised, clearly skillful, clearly gifted, but also unbelievably pompous and self-important. I mean, he is an internist, and he struck me as having the personality of a classic obnoxious doctor personality. One of his poems, Mimesis, which he pronounces Mimesis, and I don't know, maybe he's right, I don't know. He has a couple poems with this title, but the most famous one, I'll read it. He said it was so tiresome to have it anthologized and celebrated and reproduced so many times. He got very tired of this, and he finally grew to think that the country that was celebrating it really didn't understand it. And he came to think that that Americans didn't really deserve to read it. I don't think the problem with this poem is that it's too obscure or too subtle. I do think that he has a really, really smart opening sentence, or opening, almost, independent clause. Really smart. And I think it's a well done poem overall. I don't think it's a riddle wrapped in an enigma. I think it's pretty straightforward. And I think he uses a trick that Oscar Wilde points out in criticizing the dialogue of his day. This is the poem real quick. It's called Mimesis by Fadi Judah. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider that had nested between her bicycle handles for 2 weeks. She waited until it left of its own accord. I'll start it over just so you can get your bearings. I do this sometimes, much to Cameron's chagrin. Mimesis by Fadi Judah. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider that had nested between her bicycle handles for 2 weeks. She waited until it left of its own accord. If you tear down the web, I said, it will simply know this isn't a place to call home, and you'd get to go biking. She said, that's how others become refugees, isn't it? So I'll read it one more time. Mimesis by Fadi Judah. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider that had nested between her bicycle handles. For 2 weeks, she waited until it left of its own accord. If you tear down the web, I said, it will simply know this isn't a place to call home, and you'd get to go biking. She said, that's how others become refugees, isn't it? Now, the poem was pretty obviously, anthologized and recirculated because of the punchline delivered in the last 2 lines. She said, that's how others become refugees, isn't it? Of course, she doesn't ever mention Palestine, or people whose homes are destroyed or whose land is claimed by others, but that is on the minds of everybody anthologizing it, without a doubt. Without a doubt. It's, and that's an effective piece of rhetoric. What I most admire about the poem is as I said, the opening independent clause. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider. That's only the beginning of a longer sentence, but my daughter wouldn't hurt a spider is obviously picking up on the received construction, she wouldn't hurt a fly, as a hyperbolic way of representing somebody's extreme gentleness. If you want to talk about how harmless, how kind, how caring, how gentle someone is, you say he wouldn't hurt a fly. And it is a really cunning inversion here to substitute the word spider there for fly. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider. Because, of course, spiders prey on flies. And part of the nature of the conflict that Judah's writing about is that there is a constant tug of war between those claiming to be victims and those claiming, accusing others of being the terrorist or oppressors or murderers. And the truth is that there is violence committed by both sides. It's a war. And so very often the people being killed justly or unjustly are themselves killers. What I thought of throughout reading these poems was the Irish War of Independence and the Troubles in Northern Ireland later in the 20th century. But my daughter wouldn't hurt a spider, I thought, was really keen, really cutting. The part that Oscar Wilde would have objected to is that, he said there's a thing playwrights love to do where they have an idea for just a killer punchline. And so they take the punchline, they put it in the mouth of their favorite character, and then they take a less favored character and they have that character say some stupid shit to set up the punchline. He says the problem is you in order to set up your punchline, you have a secondary character say something nobody would ever say in order to give the other character an opportunity to deliver that spike of a punchline. And that's what Judah does here with himself. He has himself saying to his daughter, whose bicycle handles have a spider web on them, if you tear down the web, it will simply know this isn't a place to call home and you'd get to go biking. A sentence uttered by no father ever, even in paraphrase to his daughter whose bicycle has a spider web on it. That's my primary objection to it. I thought a much better poem of his that he read was the Tea and Sage poem. It's a little bit longer, and it's one in which he juxtaposes a couple of different stories about drinking tea and the way tea is drunk in Palestine. The offer is you drink your tea with sage or with mint. And he begins with a different kind of cup of tea. So I'll read it a couple times. You can get your bearings in it. The Tea and Sage poem by Fadi Judah. At a desk made of glass, in a glass-walled room with red airport carpet, an officer asked my father for fingerprints, and my father refused. So another offered him tea, and he sipped it. The teacup template for fingerprints. So he's describing a scene in which his father was stopped in an airport and interrogated and asked to provide fingerprints, and he refused to provide them. It's the Tea and Sage poem. At a desk made of glass, in a glass-walled room with red airport carpet, an officer asked my father for fingerprints, and my father refused. So another offered him tea, and he sipped it. The teacup template for fingerprints. My father says it was just hot water with a bag. My father says in his country, because the earth knows the scent of history, it gave the people sage. I like my tea with sage from my mother's garden. Next to the snapdragons, she calls fish mouths coming out for air, a remedy for stomach pains she keeps in the kitchen, where she always sings. First, she is Hagar boiling water where tea is loosened. Then she drops in it a pinch of sage and lets it sit a while. She tells a story. The groom arrives late to his wedding, wearing only one shoe. The bride asks him about the shoe. He tells her he lost it while jumping over a house wall, breaking away from soldiers. She asks, tea with sage or tea with mint? With sage, he says. Sweet scent, bitter tongue. She makes it. He drinks. I'll read it one more time. Just to, for those of you who have a little trouble following poems, I said his father was stopped in an airport. I don't know. It says red airport carpet. It might not be an airport. We know he's stopped by officers. And they seem to be officers from a different country, a different, whether this is, these are Israeli officers or American officers. Judah lives in the States, and he was born in Texas. I don't know, but they seem not to be from the father's homeland. The father gives a little account of why Palestinians drink tea with sage. Judah uses that sage as a way to pivot to his mother's garden where she grows sage. We hear a little bit about his mother, and then we hear a mention of Hagar, who was the mother of Ishmael, the servant woman of Abram, later Abraham, whom he impregnated when God told him that he was going to have a son, because he didn't believe his wife Sarai could bear a son at her age. It turned out she later bore Isaac, at which point Hagar and Ishmael were cast out of Abraham's camp. The story goes that Ishmael is the forefather of the people who end up being the first Muslims. So it's sort of it's a little bit like, he's a little bit like Muslim Aeneas, right? The branch breaks off there, from the originating Hebrew trunk. And then it ends with a story that the mother tells of a groom arriving late to his wedding, and what he's escaping from, and what his bride does to welcome him back when he arrives. So I'll read through it again, and then maybe say another word about it. The Tea and Sage poem by Fadi Judah. At a desk made of glass in a glass-walled room with red airport carpet, an officer asked my father for fingerprints, and my father refused. So another offered him tea, and he sipped it. The teacup template for fingerprints. My father says it was just hot water with a bag. My father says in his country, because the earth knows the scent of history, it gave the people sage. I like my tea with sage from my mother's garden. Next to the snapdragons, she calls fish mouths coming out for air, a remedy for stomach pains she keeps in the kitchen where she always sings. First, she is Hagar boiling water where tea is loosened. Then she drops in it a pinch of sage and lets it sit a while. She tells a story. The groom arrives late to his wedding, wearing only one shoe. The bride asks him about the shoe. He tells her he lost it while jumping over a house wall, breaking away from soldiers. She asks, tea with sage or tea with mint? With sage, he says. Sweet scent, bitter tongue. She makes it, he drinks. So, what do I like about this poem? I'll start with with some reasons that people might object to it. Like people who listen to this podcast might object that it has no. Cameron would probably say the language is sort of boring and overly plain. It's true. I don't think the language is particularly dazzling. I don't think that it's creating vortices or reinventing the possibilities of sonic combinations between English words. It's also not it's not metrical, doesn't rhyme. He does in the beginning, he seems to be working with a 2-beat line for a while, but then that doesn't really hold up. But, with maybe one exception, I think the lines hold together pretty well. 1-2 exception. I don't think the lines have an extraordinary integrity. There's only maybe 1 or 2 places where I trip a little bit. Here's a line, in it a pinch of sage. Then she drops stanza break, in it a pinch of sage. I think that's a little bit of a clumsy line break. But for the most part, I think the line breaks serve the pace and the sense of the poem. There is a credible spokenness to this poem. It's not that I hear some particular twangy dialect. It's not that I hear a specific character uttering this speech, but there is a spokenness to it that's totally credible. And when he includes specific sensory details, when he includes nouns or descriptions, they all seem pretty functional. There isn't a lot of wasted language in this poem. That is, it's credible at the level of speech. It tells 2 stories with some associative discussions in between, all pretty clearly and in a way that, when it uses tea, and specifically sage tea, as a thread to stitch all of these different parts together pretty seamlessly. That's very difficult to do, and while there aren't really any verbal fireworks, I think this actually might not be so easy a poem to translate, or rather, I think you could translate it superficially pretty easily. You could translate the denotation without a lot of trouble, I suspect. It's not like there's a great deal of wordplay in the poem, but I think it might be more difficult to capture the plainness of the tone and the evenness of the mood quite the way he executes it. This is also a poem about suffering, right? It's a poem in which some people are mistreated. That's odd. They're free verse, but he has all tercets except for at the very end. The one little question that's not in a 3-line stanza is tea with sage or tea with mint. I guess it's a binary. But this is not a poem in which he shakes a fist and says, and here's what we ought to do: join the march, vote for X, write your congressman. He does what lyric poems do. He evokes an experience. He uses a quotidian, very human ritual as an anchor for a human experience, right? We hear about those soldiers that the groom is running away from, but the focus of that scene is his conversation with his bride when he returns. We hear about the father, being tricked into giving up his fingerprints, but for the father, the the moral of the story was that this was just hot water with a bag. It wasn't even tea. The teacup that they used to lift his fingerprints, it wasn't even real tea inside. Not as far as this man is concerned. So I think, like the best war poems, I think of Yeats. I mean, even his An Irish Airman Foresees His Death, which is about a soldier in flight, a pilot in flight. What he's writing about is the immediacy of the human experience. He's not waving a banner telling you to perform a political function. That's a fine thing to do. I just don't think poems are very good at doing it. And that's not what Judah's doing here. I think it's another question whether reading a poem like this then makes one inclined to think or act or speak differently about Palestine, about the people who live there. But what he's doing here is the work of lyric poetry. And I think he does it pretty well. Now, the prize, the prize was like a $50,000 prize. It was some outrageous. I mean, again, take the money and run, Fadi. I don't begrudge any poet who can get a payday like that. I don't begrudge him, but I don't think he's a poetic genius for the ages, but I think he's pretty good, and he is certainly very convincing as a salesman of himself. He closed with a very long and very bad poem that was a sort of exhausting litany that by my lights was sort of put to shame. I mean, it's a very different context, but the more poignant version of the litany that Judah offered, which was a kind of a poeticized imagining of many different ways of thinking about people who were undergoing suffering in Gaza or were thinking about suffering in Gaza. I think that the truer and more devastating version of that was the one that was offered by Moussa Babutoa in his interview with Amy Goodman. One line I thought that was quite good from Olivia Elias. She does have some very sort of straight ahead didactic flag waving poems. I thought the last line of this poem, "It always starts with words," was quite good. Does horror have no bottom, just like hell? I mean, not just because it's an iambic pentameter in English, but I think because it casually invokes hell as a place with a known condition, like that horror is the more. It's almost like hell in that comparison is more familiar than the horror currently being confronted. I just think it's a small but well turned little line. Does horror have no bottom, just like hell? Yeah, there's kind of a little bit of a poly rhythm going on within that pentameter, right? Because it's iambic pentameter. Does horror have no bottom, just like hell? But it also could be scanned. What is that? It's not an amphibrach, but every fourth syllable is stressed, starting with the second one. Does horror have no bottom, just like hell? What would that be? Something singers do that sometimes. We had a whole long conversation in the Substack chat about the singer Peaches doing that with some of her songs, where she would take a simple, tetrameter or pentameter meter, and then she would complicate it by inserting further emphases within it. But yeah, I thought that was a good line. I thought, there were a lot of very moving perspectives and moving figures and individuals, but mostly very trite and unconvincing claims or sentiments. I mean, I definitely don't want to pick on her because she is almost certainly she's probably the most sympathetic figure, Hiba Abu Nada, was killed on October 20th. So 2 weeks after, not even 2 weeks after October 7th, she was killed in her home by an airstrike. But I think at least in English, I mean, I don't know. My assumption is that there's a lot more grace to these poems in Arabic, but in English, the third stanza of this poem, I grant you refuge, is, I grant you and the little ones refuge, the little ones who change the rocket's course before it lands with their smiles. And I don't know what that's saying. I guess you can take it at face value, in which case it's just not true. It's horrible. It's horrible. It's horrible to think about children being faced with a rocket. I mean, that's horrifying. And it's it's a horrifying reality. And my heart is broken but it's not good poetry. It's sort of treacly nonsense. The little ones who change the rocket's course before it lands with their smiles. I mean, there was something that Judah said in his description of boyhood, because Patrick Otuma asked my least favorite question, or he asked some version of my least favorite interview question, which was, tell me about your childhood. Good God, good, very good way to make me skip ahead. Though I didn't in this case. I listened to the whole fucking thing. But Judah mentioned that he and the other boys on the bus would play a game in which they would recite lines of verse. These were like known canonical lines of Arabic poetry. And the game was each boy would recite a line of verse, and then the next boy would have to recite a line beginning with the letter that ended the previous boy's line, so that they would play this itsy bitsy spider association game based on the beginning and ending letter of familiar lines of poetry from their Arabic studies. I mean, which just tells you so much about the richness and the detail of their familiarity with poetry from a very young age. And it reminded me a little bit of what I've read about, and ghazals, if I'm not mistaken, are Persian originally. Is that right? No, they're Arabic. Why did I think they were Persian? Sorry. I'm sorry, Sanaz. Not Persian. Arabic. Okay, all right. I'm not wrong, though, to make the association then. Oh, it's spread from the Indian subcontinent, so it's probably crossed a few different languages in its development. But the thing that I had always heard about ghazals was that they were used they were performed like battle raps. You would be spontaneously composing these ghazal couplets in sort of in a contest with the other poet and in response to the other poet. And so which makes ghazals about 1 million times more interesting than your typical English language ghazal in America today. But it just it suggested to me that there's a whole improvisatory and live and orally sensitive aspect to Arabic poetry that we're just completely not getting in these English translations. And so I do, I want to give the poets that kind of credit, because what we're left with in English here is very paltry. Again, the subject matter is just shattering. I mean, there's so many mothers and fathers and children and coffins and body parts and devastated homes and schools and garden. There's so much awful violence and loss. It's knowing that these are accounts of real events, or at least approximations of real events, is terrible. They're just not good poems. I mean, many of these I thought should just be reports, just prose, factual reports about what happened, because it's not only that what makes the poems most powerful is the factual historical content. It's also that if that content were not factual and historical, the power would be lost. So it's not in these cases. It's unlike, say, that the Sage and the Tea and Sage poem. Unlike that, it's these are poems in which the really having happenedness of the horror and loss is sort of crucial to the poignancy of the poem. So I did want to get to the interview with Musa Babutoa. As I said, he was himself incredibly sympathetic, very like a moving testimony, but also like a likable guy. Like I immediately liked him, and I was moved by him. I mean, he spoke very earnestly, extremely credible from, just from the very beginning. I also kind of appreciate that he, like Padre Gotuma, was real sweaty under the lights. Clearly was not in his element. But the litany that he offered, that was so much more affecting than Judah's closing poem, was over the course of this interview, as Amy Goodman is asking him questions and trying to draw out certain kinds of answers. He answers her questions, but what's apparent is he is taking every available opportunity to say aloud the names of individual people who have died. He just says their names. He just crams their names in. He knows he's got this slot, this interview slot to speak, and he is just frantically saying aloud names of the dead into the microphone. And that was just heartbreaking. I mean, it said more than most of the rest of these poems combined. It was the most affecting use of language that I encountered in this set of readings and interviews. As I said, Brian Cox read a poem, or rather they played this video of Brian Cox reading a poem. The poem is called If I Must Die. It's by Rafat Al-Arir. And Al-Arir died before this poem was circulated, or at least was circulated with enthusiastically as it was by Cox and others. Here's the poem. If I Must Die by Rafat Al-Arir. This is translated into English by Sinan Antoun. If I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child, somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. I'll read it one more time. If I Must Die by Rafat Al-Arir. If I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. So this poet died in a bombing during this conflict with Israel. I mean, he was killed in an Israeli airstrike December 6th. Oh, Jesus Christ. Along with his brother's son, his sister, and her 3 children. It's just horrifying. It was absolutely horrifying. And he wrote this poem about his own death before it happened. And after his death, this poem was circulated. And it's hard not to be affected by the mere facts. However, the poem is very bad. Why is it very bad? Well, I mean, set aside its logic, which is like inadvertently comical and ghastly in its perverse simplicity. It's filled with, again, I assume some of this is infelicitous translation. I assume also some of it is like the translator's attempt to carry over some aspects of the original. But it's got these sort of clumsy happenstantial rhymes toward the beginning and the end, but not at the beginning and the end. Things, strings, above, love. The register is all over the place. Bid no one farewell, but awaiting his dad, who left in a blaze. He bids no one farewell, not even to himself, not even to his flesh. So, I mean, this is just not a parallel construction. This is just like syntactical clumsiness there. Seize the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, right? Which is, flying up above is 3 words in order to say one word, which is just flying, which means exactly the same thing. Tail, right? Which is the sort of bad pun on tail. It's a kite with a long tail at the end. Let it be a tail. In addition to being a bad pun, tail there is again like not quite a consistent register for the voice of the poem as a whole. And then after all of the clumsiness of the language and the lines themselves, here is the actual argument of the poem. If I must die, you must live to tell my story. I mean, this is actually, now that I think of it, this is the sentiment of Hamlet's last words to Horatio. How does he could put it? He doesn't want to leave such a wounded name, that Horatio must live to tell his story, even though Horatio says, I'm more an antique Roman than a Dane, that Horatio wants to take poison to die with his prince, but Hamlet says, no, you have to stay behind and tell my story. But so Alarier's poem, the argument is, okay, so if I die, you have to stick around, sell my things, and buy, with the money from my things, you buy a piece of cloth and some strings, and you make a kite. Why do you make a kite? So that a child in Gaza, you fly the kite, this kite high in the air, white kite with a long tail, you fly it in the air, and there's some child in Gaza looking up at the heaven, looking heaven in the eye, which I guess means that he's staring at the sun, looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze. Horrifying. The child is waiting for his father who was killed in a bomb blast. I mean, it's horrible. It's a horrible thing to think about, but it's very badly done in this poem. So you're going to fly this white kite in the sky so that this orphaned child will look up and see the kite and think that it's an angel and believe that the angel is bringing back hope, love, and he will feel hope because of the tail of this angel, tail of this angel, which is not an angel but a kite. So the point is that when I die, you should trick a child into having false religious hope for a moment. I don't know. I find that sort of appalling to think about as an actual argument. But again, this is a man, a poet, a teacher of poetry, who was killed in a bombing along with his whole fucking family, including children. And then he wrote, before that he wrote a poem about dying, and after his death, the poem about his dying was passed around. And so, it's a terrible conundrum, right? Of course people latched onto this. Of course, I was talking to Charmaine tonight, and I said, well, if people are gonna grab hold of some viral piece of content, with a person's photograph and name and death date and death circumstances, so if they're gonna pass this piece of data around, why do they have to do it with a bad poem attached? What is the value of that? It feels to me, what's galling to me about it is not that a poet is getting praise for a bad poem. I'm not so worried about that. What galls me is it seems condescending of the people praising it. So it's just like, why does it have to be a poem? Why does the poem have to be the vehicle for that kind of empathy? And as I said it, I felt like I had answered my own question. Like, well, because it apparently is. Because apparently people do pass a poem around like that. They do have, Brian Cox sappily reading this sappy poem. They take that video and they pass it around in a way that they wouldn't with mere facts. In a way that they wouldn't with a mere photograph of Hiba Abu Nada. They want the poem is the tortilla chip that delivers the salsa. I mean, I guess it's ghastly, but I guess that may be the case. I mean, in which case, like, I don't, as we've talked about innumerable times, like, I tend to be very unconvinced by arguments for political poetry, but, hey, this may be poetry that has a political effect. In which case, however, its value then must be measured by its actual effect. Which is maybe why I was sort of so annoyed by the smug, sycophantic praise of Fadi Judah, and I hope that interview with Musab Abu Toa, had some of the effect that he was hoping it had. Because boy, Amy Goodman got her money's worth out of it. Boy, she went home feeling really good about herself after that interview. So Abu Toa's poems that he read were of two kinds, right? One was actually a sort of a blunt lyrical response to the Rafat al-Arir poem. The other poems he read were just basically like versified reportage. He was reporting on soul-shattering events. For my money, he didn't need to do it in pseudo-poem form. He could just write these as reports. But again, maybe that's not the format people want. But what gave the poems their power was that they were real events that he was describing. And had they not been real events, the poems would not have had that power. So effectively, these were not poems. These were just accounts of historical occurrences. The one, slightly more, actually lyrical compositions that he had was his very short response to the Rafat al-Arir poem. Because he knew al-Arir. And he wrote a poem called A Request after Rafat al-Arir. So this is in response to If I Must Die. Al-Arir says, if I must die, you must live and tell my story and buy this cloth and make a kite and fly the kite and trick the child and create hope. Here's Musab Abu Toa's response. If I am going to die, let it be a clean death. No rubble over my corpse. No broken dishes or glasses. And not many cuts in my head or chest. Leave my ironed, untouched jackets and pants in the closet, so I may wear some of them again at my funeral. He didn't say so, but when I heard that, it felt like he really had just punched a hole through al-Arir's ghoulish contrivance. I mean, again, I don't. This is the problem. And this is why, all of these nice white people were so nicely praising all of these poems. You don't want to speak ill of the poems of a dead man or of somebody who is suffering or somebody who's speaking about that suffering. But if we're going to respect these people as poets, then I think we have to talk about the poems as poems. And I thought this was quite well done of Musab Abu Toa as a poet. I think this is well done as a poem. I mean, it is very prosy. It's very blunt. There's not really much music, certainly not much beauty to it. But, I'm not sure how many words you could adjust without diminishing the effect of this poem. If I'm going to die, let it be a clean death. No rubble over my corpse. No broken dishes or glasses. And not many cuts in my head or chest. Leave my ironed, untouched jackets and pants in the closet, so I may wear some of them again at my funeral. There's this, the subtle distinction that he would really like the clothes to be pristine, but he doesn't expect his body to be left uncut, unmarked, unmutilated. He would just like there to be not many cuts in his head or chest. Yeah, as I said, I found Mosaba Butoa just utterly sympathetic, and his whole presentation really moving. Other than that poem, I thought his poems were mostly just reports, and reading some of the poems in Forest of Noise, based on the date of publication, it was written very quickly. And it reading the poems, and it did, the ones I read, it felt like it was written very quickly. And, maybe that will have a meaningful effect for him and his family. I don't know. I am left with no real conclusions. I did, for what it's worth, I'm not going to try to treat this as a, fair and balanced both sides podcast, because A, this is not a political podcast, and B, Leila sent me a really great detailed list of information on Palestinian poems. I'm not going to try to, hurriedly match that. But that said, I did take some time to look up poems written by the family members of people killed on October 7th or kidnapped on October 7th. Truly, truly nightmarish crimes committed that day. And real suffering by Israelis, by people, whose civilian families were butchered or kidnapped. And those poems were fucking awful too. They were very bad. They were, the facts of the poems, the facts behind the poems were heartbreaking. And I bear no, I don't blame any of these poets. I don't blame them at all for writing the poems or for publishing them, or, but I think, again, are we talking about poetry? What are we talking about? If we're just talking about politics, okay, fair enough. But we're not. We're pretending that we're talking about one thing while sort of talking about another. Yeah, that's what leaves me with a really funny taste in my mouth. But I'm very grateful to Leila for all of the hard work she did. Effectively, co-producing this whole episode. I imagine she will disagree with a lot of what I said. And fair play to her, and you're welcome to write back in. Any of you, welcome to write in. I imagine a lot of you disagreed with a lot of things I said, and that's fair too. One last word on politics. In the days after the election, so Joanna's out of town again. I'm solo with the girls, but in the days immediately following the election, I had 2 long conversations with close friends, very good friends, one of whom voted for Harris, as, no fucking surprise, I did as well. One of whom voted for Harris, one of whom voted for Trump. And I had long conversations with both of them, and I really, really disagree with one of them. I really disagree, and I think it does matter. But I think, and I know this will anger some good thinking, right thinking liberals, but I think it is a good thing to be in conversation with people you disagree with this stuff about. Not because it's trivial, because some of it really is not. Some of it is really, really serious. And I really disagree with some people, but I know there are a lot of, my guess is this is a poetry podcast. Most of the people listening to it voted for Harris, but I know there are a lot of Trump voters who listen as well. And I really disagree, but I think it's actually good to be in conversation. And it's good also to be in conversation about other shit as well. So no answers, no morals, no solutions. But I am, in the words of Louis McNeice, I am glad to have sat under thunder and rain with you. All right, I think I'll leave it there. There'll be a Secret Show episode up soon. I don't know what about. Thank you all for listening, and yeah, I wish you all well. I hope you're all safe. And with any luck, I'll be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.